Welcome back to Bad Attitude C10. So as I mentioned in the last video, I've been working with Luke over at Howard to come up with a new camshaft to be used in the truck. The original camshaft that I was going to use, we were pairing with a S480 turbo that we had for the original build in a blow-through carb. Since I decided to go with the centrifugal supercharger and EFI, I decided to get a cam that's a little more friendly. At first, I was just going to kind of utilize what I had, but I had a lot of power left on the table by doing that, so I saved up some money, and with the help of Howard's, we created another cam, and this is what we're going to run. So as you can see, here's the differences in the duration and everything, and we did increase a little bit of overlap to the camshaft. And if you don't have a way to figure out overlap on a camshaft, Texas Speed has a calculator you can use. You just put in the intake duration, the exhaust duration, and the lobe separation, hit calculate, and it gives you the total. If you don't have access to that, you can just grab a calculator, and the overlap's determined by adding the intake and exhaust duration at 50 together. Then divide that total number by 4. Once you get that total, subtract the total by the cam's LSA, which in our case is a 115, and that number you would multiply by 2. So the 6.5 would multiply 2, and voila, here we go, 13, just as the cam profile showed. So we're going to go ahead and remove this camshaft, and here we go. So guys, I know that YouTube is littered with LS cam swap videos, but we're still going to do this because, hey, you know, that's what our viewers watch. So I'm going to start off by removing the valve covers and go ahead and loosen up my rocker arms so I could get the push rods out. Well, as you can tell, the O-rings in my standoffs kind of had my valve cover stuck, so we had to use a dead blow to loosen it up. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen up all my rocker arms except for one, and that way hopefully everything stays lined up pretty good. And go ahead and snag the push rods out, and I'm just going to put them in a towel and wrap them up for now, because we're not going to be able to finish the cam swap today. The cam retaining plate that I ordered, even though the one that's in the engine is new, it's been torqued down and everything, and I'm removing it, so I wanted to get a new one just to be safe. So after I removed all the rocker arms, or loosened up the rocker arms, should I say, and removed the push rods, I went on ahead and reinstalled my valve covers. So again, I'm doing this, and we're going to revisit, you know, finishing up the cam swap after I get the new retaining plate. So I then moved over to the other side and pretty much, you know, did the same thing as before. Removed the valve cover first, and then we'll get to loosen up the rocker arms. And guys, I'm sorry the audio is not working, but as I mentioned in the previous video, one of my cameras, the audio does not sync to the video and the picture's blurry. The camera that has a good picture quality, for some reason the audio's not working. So here we go, we went on ahead and loosened up the rocker arms again, and I'm removing the push rods. And guys, our push rods we did measure and ordered for the camshaft that we originally went with. Now the base circle on the new cam, and since they're both Howard's cams, is the same, so these push rods should work just fine. So the push rods are 080 wall, 11/32 push rods, and they are 7.350 in length. Now the the LS7 lifters we're running from Trick Flow, they require a 50 to 75 thousandths of preload. So this put us in the ballpark of that, and we will double check it whenever we install the new cam. So I'm going to go ahead and put this valve cover back on and button it back up, and then we'll move forward. So for the rest of the video, I'm going to go ahead and inset the picture of the one that's normally blurry and just make it a little smaller so it's not as distorted. And that way we can hear some of the audio whenever we're disassembling the front of the engine. So I started off by removing the low mount alternator that we had installed and the bracketry for it. And if you notice, it did not have an adjustment on it, so I had to buy a belt that is pretty snug, and then the pulley that was supposed to be the tensioner pulley for the power steering system is actually putting pressure on the top of the belt to keep it to where it should stay in the grooves and not be thrown off. We'll find that out, you know, down the road. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and loosen all this up and get the belt off and remove the low mount alternator. So up next, I needed to remove the mandrel for the supercharger, and so I went on ahead and got a 15/16 socket out and removed the stud. Now this thing, I had to pry it off, guys, because there's actually a keyway for the aftermarket balancer, and I had to drill 2 dowel holes to pin the mandrel. That way it never spin, because it is a, you know, belt driven supercharger. So if you see here, you can see where one of the dowels came out, and then there's the hose for the other dowel, and then the crank actually has a keyway for the dampener marked right here. So that's going to be another round dowel for the supercharger, and the first one I pointed at was the rectangular or square one for the actual balancer. So I have an aftermarket balancer, so instead of using one of the OEM style deals, I had to use my steering wheel puller, and my bolts that fit the dampener were a little long, so I grabbed some spare lug nuts for my front wheels that I have, and I went on ahead and used them as spacers to where I could chuck this up and remove the balancer. So here you can actually see where the actual keyway and the dowels were cut for the balancer and for the mandrel for the supercharger. So up next, I'm going to remove the lower two bolts from the oil pan that go into my timing cover, and then I'm going to remove the timing cover. So I had to use a ratchet and a socket to break these bolts free, because my 1/2-inch drive impact I was having to let charge, and my little 1/4-inch nut driver wouldn't break them loose because they were torqued a little bit more than it could handle. So after loosening them up, I got my little driver out and then removed them, and I had to pry the cover off. I didn't even think about it, but my remote water pump adapter blocks evidently had a little bit of pressure, so before I put this back together, I will need to remove them. So up next, I needed to get my timing mark lined up with the dot in the bottom. My bolt's a little long for the mandrel and everything, so I used some of the washers that are for my 5/8 studs for the back wheels of the truck, because I have spares of those as well. That way I can space it and not, you know, basically tighten my bolt up and strip anything or anything like that. I had something that it could snug up against. So we went on ahead and turned the motor over, and if you pay attention to the picture, you're going to see some little blue flying objects where I didn't pull the plugs that I had actually paper towels wadded up in my spark plug holes, and I just saw stuff start shooting across the floor, and at first I panicked and I was like, oh shit, what was that? But that's all it was some of the blue shop rags. So I'm going to line up my dots, and it's going to be 6 o'clock on the cam gear, 12 o'clock on the crank. I couldn't get a good picture of the one that's on the crank, so that's why I didn't show it to you. And then using a little impact, I went on ahead and loosened up my cam bolts and made sure the alignment stayed, and then I removed it. So using my little pry bar, I then got the timing gear loose from the cam and removed it from the timing chain, and then laid the timing chain to the side, and we'll move on to the next step. So there's 4 camshaft retaining bolts that are actually a star socket in the aftermarket one that we bought. So you have to have a special bit to get them off. So if you end up buying something like that, be sure you do have a star bit, because a regular Allen does not work real good on them, and you don't want to take a chance of stripping anything out. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a brand new aftermarket cam retainer, but since it has been torqued, I didn't know if the sealing ring was still going to be good, and that does depend on your oil supply to your lifters. So using some 5/16-inch dowels, I'm going to go ahead and put them in the oil galley hose that I'm about to show you right here. And those will be inserted to bind the lifters to make sure they don't fall into the pan. So using a couple of bolts, we're going to go ahead and snug them up in the cam itself to where I can rotate the cam and use it as a small handle to get it out. The handle I use to install the cam does not bolt to it, so if I try to use it to pull a cam out with it, the handle just slides out. So I rotate it to get the lifters held up in the trays, and then I'll insert the rod and make sure it bottoms out on the back side. And once that's done, we will basically remove the camshaft. Now guys, be careful when you're walking it out, because you don't want to booger up the bearings. Now guys, since this is a roller camshaft and it's not a flat tappet, I'm just using the oil that we're going to run in the engine. So it's actually some break-in oil is what's on the cam itself, and I'm going to reinstall, or should I say install, the new camshaft that we're going to be using in the Bad Attitude C10. Again, try to do this very carefully. You do not want to booger up your cam bearings. And as you can see here, this time I have a little bit of a handle to have a little bit better control in walking the camshaft in. So again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the cam retainer plate and just put 2 bolts in it to keep the cam in where it needs to be, because I'm going to put the front cover back on with a couple of bolts just to keep this engine sealed up, because the cam retainer plate's supposed to be here tomorrow. It was supposed to be here today, but it got held up, and I'm thinking that's probably because we did have Veterans Day on Monday, so the mail's running a little bit behind. After snugging the bolts up in the retaining plate, I'm going to go ahead and loosen one of the bolts in the camshaft up and go ahead and kind of hang the timing chain up by it. That way it doesn't get stuck in between the cover and anything and, you know, cause something to bind up. So I had mentioned that the cover was kind of hung up by the remote water pump mount, so I'm going to go ahead and remove my adapter blocks for that and get them out of the way. That way they're not, you know, causing any obstruction or anything whenever we go to put the timing cover back on. So with the timing cover reinstalled, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this back up in a plastic bag, and when the retainer plate gets back, you know, I'll get back out here in the shop and we'll complete the camshaft swap in the Bad Attitude C10. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll catch y'all later.